It's a fanatical faith in their religious destiny, is the bottom line. They firmly believe that they're on a divine mission, and therefore everything that happens is part of that divine destiny. It almost takes their own agency away from it. And if they become martyrs, then that's also a win because they get to go to Jannah and all the rest of it. So it does make a real problem with how the end of this war goes. And we saw it with Hamas in Gaza because Hamas just won't quit. And it's because they have that religious belief. And it's the same in Iran. And that's going to make the end of this war as difficult as it was in Gaza, but scaled up to a country of 90 million rather than a 2 million enclave.
As we're speaking right now, the United States and Israel are in the middle of a direct war with Iran. For decades, this conflict played out in the shadows: cyber operations, assassinations, proxy militias, and covert strikes across the Middle East. But now it's out in the open. Iran has launched waves of ballistic missiles and drones across the region. Israel and the United States are striking targets deep inside Iran. Hezbollah has begun launching attacks from Lebanon, and Iranian-backed militias are threatening escalation across the region. Some analysts say this could become the most dangerous war the Middle East has seen in decades. Joining me today, once again, is Andrew Fox, a former British Army officer and defense analyst who has spent years studying modern warfare and military strategy in the Middle East. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Andrew, Israel and Iran have fought a shadow war for decades. Now it's out in the open. From a military standpoint, how historic is this moment?
Well, I mean, that's almost an impossible question to answer because it's going to need hindsight before we realize exactly how big of a deal this war turns out to be. It could go one of two ways, I think. It's either a decisive moment where the Middle East entirely shifts on its axis, the regime is no more, and there is a future for Iran to take its place amongst the region as an equal partner. Or alternatively, it could have a different ending where the regime somehow clings on, in which case this is maybe just a pause or another stepping stone. But undeniably, it's going to set that regime's capabilities back by at least a decade. So, either way, it's something we've never seen before in terms of that direct confrontation between Israel and Iran, American involvement that maybe, I think, at the end of Afghanistan, certainly, we didn't think was going to happen again. So yeah, we live in interesting times, and history will make its decision in due course.
You know that when historians look back at this conflict, what do you think they will say actually triggered the conflict?
I think 7th of October is the one that obviously springs to mind. I mean, this has been a cascade, and I think a mistake a lot of people in the West, certainly in Europe, have made is looking at what's happened in the last 2.5 years and seeing them as separate incidents, be that the operations in Lebanon, be that Gaza, be that the Houthis, be that Iran itself. People haven't really connected the dots that this is all one conflict that starts and finishes in one place, and that's Tehran. We can pinpoint all the mistakes that were made in the run-up to 7th of October as waypoints on that journey, but the decisive trigger-pulling moment was that appalling day.
Yeah. Now, the opening strikes reportedly eliminated key Iranian leadership, including the Ayatollah and command centers. From a military perspective, how difficult is it to carry out an operation like that? And what does it tell us about Israel's intelligence capabilities that they were able to strike so deeply inside Iran?
I mean, the most compelling thing here is how that whole operation on the first day was synchronized. That's almost the hardest part. The intelligence part was obviously difficult, but it was done over years. It was done slowly. They built up a lot of intelligence and penetration, so they had that saturation of intelligence. But having the ability to realize that the trigger moment had arrived, that the Ayatollah and all his team were getting together in these three different locations, and then be able to get the jets in the air to reach it in time, really impressive synchronization. And that's the most impressive thing for me, because anyone can be good at intelligence. Anyone can be good at planning airstrikes, but bringing those two things together at such scale with such strategic impact that you take out the entire leadership of the enemy is an incredible achievement. A real testament to just how good Israel and CENTCOM are at planning these operations.
And when you remove an entire command structure like that, what happens to a military's ability to coordinate a response? And how quickly can a military recover after losing their leadership?
Well, it depends how ready you are for it. I think one thing we have learned this week is that the Iranians were ready for it. And they are operating quite surprisingly effectively, I think, given the fact that they've lost their entire command of control. And reports suggest that the way they've done this is by giving an order of essentially devolution of command. We know there are 11 IRGC headquarters across the country, and they all have subordinate headquarters. And it sort of builds in a sort of sponginess, a springiness to their chain of command, so they can still keep operating, even without their senior commanders being anywhere near the planet, never mind being still alive or out of the battle. So I think that has been one of the surprises of this last week, that the Iranians have landed as many punches as they have, because they don't need to respond in kind. They don't need to have airstrikes on Tel Aviv. They don't need to be able to fire mass precision weapons. What they need to do is score a few key economic hits. And that's almost enough to cause real pressure. And I think we're seeing that pressure start to emerge this week. So I think the Iranians have been surprisingly resilient, and it's because they were prepared.
Do you think that Iran underestimated Israel's intelligence capabilities, and did they underestimate the willingness of the U.S. to intervene?
I think yes to both. It's not even an underestimation. I think it's just a completely different way of seeing the world to how we see it. Because why on earth, if you had two carrier groups parked on your doorstep, when you know that what happened last summer was you had a negotiation period, negotiations ended, and the very next day Israel struck. When you see these patterns being repeated, why on earth would you leave your bunker that's a 5-minute elevator ride underground to get to the surface and have a meeting on a Saturday morning in daylight with all your senior commanders and advisors? It's just a very different way of seeing the world to us. And I think we struggle with this in the West, certainly, where we don't do very well at reading our enemy's psychology. We failed with Putin in the run-up to the Ukraine war. Every academic I know, and myself included, didn't think Russia would go through with it, because by our strategic logic, it made no sense for Putin to do what he did. And yet he did, because he sees the world in a different way. And I think that's what really is revealed to us by the Ayatollah's decision and all his commanders' decision, is that this regime of very, very extremist religious fanatics just don't see the world the way we do. And they didn't understand what might happen as a result of their actions, because they failed to understand the other side as well.
Now, how exactly do they see the world? The West thinks that they can solve everything diplomatically, but that doesn't always translate with Iran and countries like Iran. What do you think, if you can go a little bit deeper on that?
Look, it's a fanatical faith in their religious destiny is the bottom line. They firmly believe that they're on a divine mission, and therefore everything that happens is part of that divine destiny. It almost takes their own agency away from it. And if they become martyrs, they don't kind of deliberately martyr themselves, but if they do become martyrs, then that's also a win, because they get to go to Jannah and all the rest of it. So it does make a real problem with how the end of this war goes. And we saw it with Hamas in Gaza. Like, if that had just been a Western shootout between two Western armies, like, that would have been over 18 months, maybe even 2 years before it actually ended, because Hamas just won't quit. And it's because they have that religious belief. And it's the same in Iran. And that's going to make the end of this war as difficult as it was in Gaza, but scaled up to a country of 90 million rather than a 2 million enclave. Because, first of all, who surrenders? Trump today said unconditional surrender. Okay, who's surrendering? All the leaders are dead. Do you want 11 separate surrenders from the different IRGC units? Well, what about their subordinates who don't surrender? It's really, really tricky. And if they don't surrender, what do? Do you just keep bombing them? I mean, it's a really tricky question. And I think the hardest thing about this war for Israel and the US is going to be finding that strategic end state that's acceptable. Because Trump, again, he's failed to understand. He's calling for unconditional surrender. The odds of that actually happening are almost nil. So where's the middle ground here? And that's really, really tricky as a strategic question.
Yeah. If Hamas didn't surrender, why would Iran surrender, right? I mean, that's Iran presents itself as a major military power, but how strong is Iran's military actually, and how much of that is left?
I mean, we know that conventional military is old and weak. Like, the last time we've seen it fighting was the Iran-Iraq war, of course. That was a stalemate. And if you think about that same Iraqi army that America and the coalition fought in 2003, we brushed them aside in a day or two. That's the standard of how bad they are conventionally. And that's why, first of all, they created the ring of fire around Israel. So using proxies to fight rather than their own, pretty comparatively weak armed forces. And that's why they relied on the rocket strategy as well, because that does give them a bit of strategic depth. And we've seen some success with that this week on the Iranian side. The big problem I think we have with the armed forces in Iran is the size. So they don't have good kits. They don't have good planes or tanks or anything like that. But what they do have is a lot of numbers. And that's why it's going to be very difficult to kind of take them apart, because there are just so many of them. And there's only so many bombs in the world to drop on them. So you need to fight, and if they are led by fanatics, getting them to quit, to stop, to change sides will be very difficult. So these are the problems. But in terms of military capability, we've seen how easily they were brushed aside this week. There's nothing there to write home about, but the rockets and the drones, very effective.
So it seems that Iran's real strength is their missile arsenal and the proxy networks. How strong are the proxy networks still? We saw that Hezbollah, they did shoot some missiles into Israel. How strong are the proxies still?
So the Houthis were degraded by American operations and then the ground campaign that followed on from the government of Yemen. So they're under a bit of pressure, which is why I think they've been so quiet this week. Hezbollah, they retain some capability. They do have these weapons manufacturing stocks up in the Bekaa and underground that kind of keep them in the fight-ish. But the political situation in Lebanon's changing. I don't know if you saw today, the Lebanese government has banned the IRGC. Iran uplifted Hezbollah with IRGC commanders just before this war started to try and give them a bit of command and control. But they're not landing anything that's going to cause any kind of strategic damage. Even if they do score a hit, it won't be anywhere near decisive. So they've been absolutely panelled over the last 2 years, and Israel's forward defensive policy in Lebanon is paying dividends there, I think. The one proxy I'm not concerned about, but certainly keeping an eye on, is the Iraqis, because during the fight against ISIS, there was a Shia militia in Iraq that was equal to the size of the Iraqi armed forces. And they've been deadly silent for the last 2 years since 7th of October for a variety of reasons. There's Shia dynamics. There's also that kind of pressure from the Americans all the time from that presence in Iraq. We have seen some kind of special forces type operations reported, but the details are sketchy during this week. But I think they are the ones worth keeping an eye on if they have any intent, or it might just be that they're focused on their own domestic politics in Iraq. And they're not interested in wading in or dying for Iran. So it's one to keep an eye on. They're the biggest, they're the least damaged, but they're also the most unclear as to what they're actually planning or what they think they're going to do.
Iran has launched large numbers of ballistic missiles and drones across the region, I think hitting 13 different countries or something like that, many of them Arab countries. What exactly is their strategy?
There are 3 strands to it. The first one was trying to get the Gulf states to pressure the Americans to cease fire. Fortunately, that didn't work because their air defenses and missile defenses were too good, and they've managed to stop almost all the ballistic missiles and most of the drones as well. That leg of the strategy failed. The second leg, I think, is to cause as much damage as possible if the first part didn't work. That's why I think the UAE has had the lion's share. Of course, they've been taking the short-range ballistic missiles, whilst Israel has the long-range ones fired at them. So that makes kind of logistic sense that you would do it that way, hit the close people with the short-range missiles. There you go. They've got the stocks to do it, so why not? And I think the reason they're doing it is because something like the Burj Al Arab on fire would be quite something. In terms of winning a PR blow on the information war side of things, that would be huge. Fortunately, the air defenses have mostly held up, and the one famous hotel that was hit was just a surface fire from debris rather than an actual direct strike. But the third is the really serious one, and it might actually work, and that is their attacks on fossil fuel architecture, so both petrol and gas. And we've seen hits on Aramco in Saudi Arabia. We've seen the Bahraini refinery hit. We've seen the one in Qatar hit. This is a big deal because when we factor in the Straits of Hormuz there as well, shipping has stopped. And look, we are a fossil fuel planet. The whole world runs on this stuff. And when you cut 20% of the supply, which is what goes through the Straits of Hormuz, that 20% cut is going to have a huge economic impact, and that's coming. The markets are kind of pricing it at the moment, but I suspect if this goes on much longer, people are really going to start feeling the pain at the petrol pump, at the supermarket, and that's going to make this war incredibly unpopular if it keeps going on. And of course, Trump will have one eye on the American midterms, so he needs to make sure that this is over in good time, that prices return to normal, voters kind of see a great win rather than an unfolding disaster that caused the global economy to crash. So that third strand of the missile strategy, I think, has a relatively good chance of success if the Americans can't get the Straits of Hormuz open.
But at the same time, aren't they creating enemies for themselves? For example, Qatar was their partner. Don't they share an oil field where Qatar I just gives them money under the table or something like that? That's what I've heard. But is that something that's in their calculation or
No, I think when it comes to surviving, they're prioritizing that. And look, I think the Qataris have been stealing from that gas or that gas field as well. So there is a tension over that particular gas field that goes straight across the middle. And the Qataris have been a bit sneaky in nicking technically Iranian gas whilst they've been sanctioned. So there are frictions there. And you know how it goes in the Middle East, the enemy of my enemy is my enemy. So there's all kinds of wheels within wheels here. You know, we were all astonished, for example, to learn that Saudi Arabia, completely 180 degrees different to their public-facing messaging, had actually been encouraging the White House to do this. Stuff like that is what happens all the time in the Middle East, and it's why it's so complicated to analyse, because people say different things to the home audience, to the international audience, and then in private they say something completely different as well. So that's really tricky. But ultimately, hitting those oil and gas facilities will cause a massive economic crash or shock. And that is the strategy that may keep the Iranian regime in power if this comes to a war, the war comes to an end prematurely. I think that's the calculus that what's left of the Iranian command is making.
Is there any scenario where Iran could realistically overwhelm Israel's missile defense systems, or Israel's air defense system is strong enough to defend most of them? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there is a single-digit percentage that will get through. That's priced in, unfortunately. No air defense system is 100%. The targeting priorities for jets has been very, very sensible. Since they took out the command structure, they immediately moved to launcher hunting and rocket hunting. And, you know, you've seen the big rocket cities that the Iranians have. They're watching them like hawks. Every time something pops out, it gets smashed. And they've also been hitting those entrances and basically collapsing them and just burying them underground. So the challenge for the Iranians here is always to actually get the numbers of rockets off. And we've seen that declining day on day on day. So the Allied campaign is definitely working. That, you know, those launches and that firing capability is getting completely degraded. So you can never say never. I mean, the Iranians might have some weird surprise, but I don't think it's very likely. You know, as you say, Israel's had months now to build up their missile defenses. This isn't the 12-day war where they were having to do it in contact. They've had the ceasefire in Gaza, the ceasefire in Lebanon. They've not been, they've been able to stand down reservists. And so they've been able to focus their military efforts on making sure the missile defenses are in place. So I think Israel's probably in a better place now than they were during the 12-day war last summer.
Now, as we said, so Israel and the United States, they destroyed a significant portion of Iran's missile launch capability. From a military standpoint, how significant is that?
I mean, it's huge, because what you're doing is taking the enemy's ability to punch you away from them. You know, it's a boxing match now where you've taken the gloves off your opponent and tied their arms behind their back. So you then just get free shots at the body for as long as you want to. And that's where we are now, really. It doesn't change the fact that the Iranians don't need to score many hits in the Gulf to make this effective. And that's the problem. And I think that's why Ukraine is going to be so important. They're going to get the Ukrainian anti-drone measures in, because it's actually the drones that have been getting through. It's not the ballistic missiles as much. I mean, there have been a couple, but the vast majority of strikes and civilian deaths in the Gulf states have been from the drones. But yeah, a couple more hits on a couple more oil refineries. And, this takes months to come back from and is really going to throttle global supply. So it's a problem. And that's why it's so vital that the US and the Israelis keep on top of these missile launches and drone launches and just keep degrading them as much as they can. Because the one thing that's going to stop them is if the world economy crashes off the back of this.
Now, the United States and Israel apparently have air superiority over Iran. How significant is that? And, can Iran do anything, when they cannot fly their own jets in the sky?
Look, let me give you another example when you can see how important it is when you don't have air superiority, and that's Ukraine-Russia. The reason the war there has evolved the way it has, in terms of the trenches, in terms of having to fight underground, and then the drone saturation across the front line, is because there is no air superiority on either side. Russian jets sit back, fire long-range glide bombs rather than getting in over the trenches and using that as sort of close air support. And the Ukrainian Air Force is used for defensive purposes for the most part to try and stop the ballistic missiles and the drones coming through. And that's what no air superiority looks like. It looks like a stalemate on the ground. Now, there's no ground forces in this war yet. And, there's all kinds of rumors about what that might look like. But the fact that there is total air superiority means they can just do whatever they want. They can hit any target they want to. If the intelligence comes up, then they can just go and knock something out. It's unprecedented in terms of freedom of maneuver, but you can't beat superiority to give you freedom and maneuver for whatever you want to do. So even if there is a proxy force that gets armed or ground troops come in or whatever it might be, if they've got complete dominance of the skies, that gives a huge amount of freedom and maneuver for those ground forces as well. So it's vital, it's essential, it's really important. And that's why there was such an emphasis placed on it in the early days of the war.
Now, if Iran continues losing these missile launchers, obviously they lost the air defense system, their command centers, they're losing their leadership. At what point does a military begin to collapse? I know you said that this is an ideology that doesn't give in, but normally, when does a military begin to collapse?
I mean, a normal military, look, people have lives and homes to go to, and someone who's not motivated by religious fervor is going to be far more susceptible to being compelled to stop fighting, because they're seeing their commanders die around them. They're seeing the bases down the road getting smashed and they know they're coming next. That's when you start surrendering. A great example, if we look back to Basra in 2003, when the British rolled an armoured division down there, look, we didn't punch into the city in the same way that you would have to if the enemy was standing and fighting. We parked outside, conducted a number of raids, sent in some leaflets telling the Iraqis to stand down, and they did. And that's the ideal situation, is you get your enemy to stop fighting rather than fight you and die. That's what you really want, because that saves your guys' lives as well. That's going to be much harder in Iran due to the religious motivation that comes with this. Now, there's different tiers to this, of course. You've got the IRGC, the super hardliners. You've got the Basij, who are probably just as fanatical. The Iranian army, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, they might be more persuadable. And that's probably where you want to focus your efforts on, and saying, look, hey, don't even think about it and you'll live. Try and stand and fight and you'll die. And that's the message you send. The other factor, I think, is if you can get some kind of ground troops in there, it's very, very difficult to do regime change from the air. And, the White House has given us their aims. They've said, it's the missiles, it's the nuclear capability, it's the commanders. The unspoken piece is the regime change. And I think that's political because it's hard to do. It's difficult to make happen, and it gives them a kind of plausible deniability if it doesn't happen. We didn't want that in the first place. That they can get away with that politically. But you need something on the ground, even if that's just incredibly empowered protesters who can storm palaces or whatever, because the army's gone away because they're deterred. If it's the Kurds who are armed and backed with air power, that might work. It could be the Baluchis or the Azeris or any of these groups that kind of all rise up at once and give you something tangible on the ground to actually affect the regime change. Because without that, all the regime has to do is survive. That's all they have to do. That's a win for them. It's like Hamas in Gaza. All they had to do was survive, and they will consider where they are right now to be a win. That's the same for the Iranian regime in Tehran. If they can just get through this alive with no one sufficiently empowered to get in there and take over from them, that's a win. So this is the balancing act that we're facing now. Very, very difficult to do from the air. They need something on the ground.
Do you think that the United States is secretly arming these groups to go in there and try to create the regime change?
I mean, there's a really interesting messaging war going on at the moment, because Washington are leaking that this is going to happen, and the Kurds are all denying it vehemently, which is a really interesting dynamic, because is the White House effectively just trying to do pressure by PR by saying it's going to happen, wishing it into existence? You're putting that pressure on them to just go, okay, fine, we'll do it. That's really, really, really nuanced at the moment. I think they'd like to. I think the Americans would like to. Whether they can find a partner to go along with it is a different thing altogether. Look, the Kurds have been betrayed repeatedly, by the Americans in Syria 2 or 3 months ago. This is going to be pretty fresh in their memories that the US has not been traditionally the most effective and reliable partner for them. So certainly if I were Kurdish, I'd be thinking twice, am I going to be left dangling again? Don't forget, after the 12-day war, the biggest reprisals from the regime were in those Kurdish areas. That's where they sort of went down hard to make sure there was no insurrection. On the flip side, the fact that they've been battered by the regime recently might give them an incentive to rise up. So it's really complicated, is the bottom line here. And you can see every sentence I come out with raises yet another issue that might be a factor here. So it's really difficult. I mean, I don't know. I think America would like to. Whether the Kurds will or not, it's very hard to say.
Now, you mentioned that Iran has these underground missile bases. Some people call them missile cities. But the analysts say that those systems are actually vulnerable once those launch points are identified, like you mentioned. Do you think that Iran overestimated how survivable those systems would be?
Yeah, I think they did. Look, being sealed underground doesn't take them out of play completely. You can always dig out something. The important thing is that they can't fire them now. And that's what matters for the course of the war. Missile stocks in the Gulf would not have held up if the Iranians had maintained their rate of fire from day one. that have degraded their missile interceptor stocks, and we'd have been looking at a week before they were defenseless, quite frankly. So it's been a priority to make sure they just can't fire them. So they don't have to destroy them right now. They just have to make sure they can't get them off the ground. Fordo was hit last summer by 12 massive ordnance penetrators, and I was told in January that Fordo was still operational. It was still operational, so they'd been able to dig it out and keep something going. That's another variable that when it comes to the end of this war, they need to take into account what strategic success looks like. Are the Iranian missile cities going to be easily dug out? And then they can get their hands on all that missile stock again. It's a really big and important question. But I don't think the Iranians have created something that can't be destroyed, but it is something that can then be collapsed in on itself and blocked from the entrances, so people can't get the missiles out. And that's what we're doing at the moment. It remains to be seen what happens to those missile stocks once the bomb stops falling.
Do you think that this war could escalate in some way? Obviously, they attacked all these different countries, but it seems to be Iran against everybody else. We haven't seen China and Russia come in and defend Iran in any way. So it's not really a World War III type of situation. What are your thoughts on if this will this broaden or not?
There are escalatory aspects that more relates to the demography of the area than anything else. Those demographics in terms of ethnic groupings, I think are a potential escalatory point. Because if you arm the Kurds, for example, that's going to get Turkey wound up. And who knows what the Turks will do at that point, because the last thing they want is an armed and successful Kurdish group on their borders. They've spent decades making sure that can't happen. If the Azeri group rises up, then that obviously brings Azerbaijan into the equation. Which way will they go? Who knows? Will they try and bite off chunks of Iran to bring it into their sphere? Are we going to see a balkanization of Iran? Maybe even a civil war? That's an escalation that I think is a possibility here. We can't say it's definitely not going to happen. And then on top of that, you've got the Baluchi in the east of Iran who border Pakistan. And they've been militant groups there for a long time. And we've seen Pakistan moving a division, I'm told, to their western border, the border with Iran. That's a potential flashpoint as well. Is Pakistan going to try and carve off a piece of Iran for itself? So that's the escalation I'm concerned about. I don't think Russia are going to get involved ever. They're far too busy in Ukraine. China have a long-standing non-intervention policy. So, that's, they're Pacific focused anyway, but the odds of them getting involved here in a military capacity are nil. But that regional demographics could cause all sorts of sort of tripwires further down the line.
Now, we know the Iranian regime is not like a normal government. It's different. How does the ideology influence the way Iran's military leadership fights wars, and why are they so hyper obsessed with Israel?
So it goes back to the key religious philosophy, which is that when certain things happen, the Mahdi will come back to lead the world to Islamic domination. Two things have to happen, amongst other things. One of those is the destruction of the state of Israel, and one of those is the destruction of America, the little Satan and the great Satan. So that's the obsession with Israel, is they believe it has to be destroyed religiously so that the Mahdi can come back and they can have a party or whatever it is they want to do. To put it in very simple terms. Now, how does that affect how they operate? Actually, there is a pragmatism, I think, and I think we're seeing it. The Ring of Steel, the Ring of Fire strategy was sensible from an Iranian perspective. If you can't fight with your own troops, fight with somebody else's who are a lot closer to your enemy than you are. That was a pretty militarily logical strategy. By the same token, the strategy we're seeing now is sensible. So there is military logic to this. So they do have thinkers there. Look, they have the capability to, train nuclear scientists. This is an advanced country in many ways. Perhaps not, a Western country, but certainly a good education system and a long, thousands of years long history. So the fact that they have managed to come up with this strategy that works, it does suggest that whilst they are religious fanatics, they also do have some pretty decent brains behind them. But they then do stupid things because of the religious philosophy, like have 3 group meetings at the same time in daylight on the surface with 2 carrier groups parked on your doorstep. So they're capable of really good thinking, but also doing cataclysmically stupid things because they're fanatics. So it's an interesting dichotomy.
Do you feel like Israel is always one step ahead of the Mossad and their technological abilities? It seems to me that they're always one step ahead.
Yeah, it's great thinking. And on the intelligence side, it's pretty untouchable. Look, Iran gave Israel this incredible gift of all their Jews. So you have people living in Israel who know the country intimately, who know the language, who understand the psychology, and who can go there and penetrate because they fit in seamlessly. So this was a huge gift to the Mossad from Iran. In terms of Israel's longer term strategy, it's really difficult for Israel because there's no clear answers to a lot of these problems. And on a lot of these fronts, Israel can't do it on their own and need other people to come into play, mainly the Americans. So that's why it was so hard to get a conclusion in Gaza. That's why it's going to be so hard to get a conclusion in Iran, because there is no logical end state that your enemy can agree to when your enemy is a fanatical religious psychopath. And that's a real strategic question. So Israel often gets criticized, and I think somewhat unfairly, for not being good at strategy. But strategy is about the end states that you can realistically get to with the means you have to get there. Israel doesn't have the means to get rid of Hezbollah completely. It doesn't have the means to create a new country out of the ruins of Iran. It needs other players. It needs allies to come in and help them with that, mainly America. So, there's a sort of hard limit on what Israel can achieve. But my goodness, in intelligence terms, they give themselves absolutely the best chance of getting as far down that journey as they can on their own.
Now, what do you think victory would be in this war with Iran? As you said, it's not going to be easy, but what should be their goals? What do you think their goals are?
Yeah, this is a really $1 million question. And it's a tricky one because obviously there are two headquarters at play here. There's the headquarters in Tel Aviv, and there's the headquarters at the Pentagon in Washington, or CENTCOM, whichever one you want to use. The motives for going to war for each side are slightly different. Israel is dealing with an existential threat. America is trying to make sure that they get an influence over 20% of China's oil. The defending the Middle East part is very much secondary, I think, for the Americans, as we saw in Venezuela. They don't care about the people at all. They care about America's influence, and America first means exactly what it says on the tin. So there's already a slight challenge to work out what victory looks like when you go into the war with your partners and you each have a slightly different reason for prosecuting it. So that's the first challenge to get past. The second challenge is the fact that we've already talked about at length, that it's very, very hard to get these zealots to surrender or quit or stand down, or even to appoint someone from inside who isn't also a psychopath. Searching for another leader, Venezuela style. There's no obvious Iranian Delcy Rodriguez who you can just put in charge and they'll be roughly America facing and that's good enough. There's no equivalent there that we've found yet. So that's really difficult. So what does victory look like? Well, I think we're there already up to a point. It's about no nukes. It's about the head of the snake being killed. It's about the missiles being absolutely degraded, so it's not a security threat to Israel. And I think if we frame it in those terms, then there's a victory that's there to be taken. Is Israel more safer for a number of years than it was before last Friday night? And if so, then that's a clear win for me. Does that look like a win for Washington that Mr. Trump can take back and use to boost his way into the midterms? Maybe not. So what does that look like? And that's really unclear from the White House, because Mr. Trump is saying unconditional surrender. And if he gets that, it'd be very, very surprising. So is he setting himself up here for an unachievable goal? And if he can't achieve that goal, does it get any better than it is now? Especially when you weigh the against column, which is 20% of the world's oil supply unable to flow, damage to infrastructure around the Gulf that's going to send prices skyrocketing in Western countries, interceptor stocks being degraded, missile stocks being degraded, all whilst China's looking on and seeing a bit of vulnerability when it comes to potentially responding to an attack on Taiwan. There's a lot of other factors at play here that have to be taken into account. And so I think for Israel, the win is clear. For Washington, they've made it almost as hard for themselves as possible to achieve what they want to. And the win is certainly a little bit less clear at this point.
Now, you have people that are anti this war, a lot of people that are anti-Israel. They say that Israel dragged America into this war. They dragged Trump into the war. Is there any possibility to that?
Yeah, I think Bibi's good, but he's not that good. There's an ingrained anti-Semitism from the 2 years of Hamas propaganda that has saturated the West. And I think anyone watching this in Israel I don't think will understand how dominant the narrative of Hamas has been and how non-existent Israel's side of the story has been for 2.5 years. And that's why you've got countries like the UK backing off, because public opinion is 8% in favour of getting involved in this. 8% of the UK public. And that's because Israel's reputation is incredibly degraded on the world stage, unfortunately. And that makes it very difficult to have that freedom of maneuver on the diplomatic side of things. But in terms of the war itself, Israel was going to have to do this anyway. Like, Israel has to survive as a nation. Any other country in Israel's position would be doing what they're doing right now. Those rockets cannot be allowed to point at Tel Aviv endlessly. It's just a permanent kind of loaded gun pointed at Israel's head. You have to do something about it. So this war had to happen. Mr. Trump has decided to, I think, escalate it from where it would have been if Israel had just gone alone, because he's seen an opportunity to tally in with his success in Venezuela to have a real impact on China's energy supplies, which is another reason why I think Cuba is being talked about a lot now as well. It's all part of the same paradigm. But I don't think America would have gotten involved if they hadn't seen that clear strategic advantage for them as well, for the simple reason that actually to get rid of the missile stocks, Israel showed last summer they can do it themselves. They don't need 2 US carrier groups. Israel's incredibly capable. They can field a 200 ship airstrike wave. That's not many countries in the world can do that. So for America to be involved, it's because they've seen a strategic advantage for themselves, and they're going to try and take it.
Now, what do you think are the biggest time pressures on this war? Could economic pressure, especially rising oil prices, force the conflict to end sooner than the United States or Israel wants it to?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the main threat. There's two ticking clocks. The first one was missile defenses in the Gulf states, and that ticking clock has slowed right down now because the launch rate has dropped off so much due to the degradation of Iranian capability over the last week. Ticking clock number 1 is actually under control right now. Ticking clock number 2 is starting to run faster and faster and faster, and that is global oil prices. We've gone from $80 to $90 a barrel now. If that keeps going up, that is going to cause a crash, and there's going to see huge amounts of diplomatic pressure globally to try and get this war to be brought to an end, not least from inside Washington itself. Trump has made big promises to the American people about what's going to happen to prices. He made big promises about not starting any other wars, and he's potentially not kept that one, shall we say. If people now start seeing prices in the supermarket start spinning out of control, if gas goes above $3 a gallon, this is big stuff on the American domestic side that is going to absolutely force people's hands to get this war to stop.
Now, if Israel and the United States didn't confront Iran now, how dangerous do you think Iran could have become in about 5 or 10 years from now?
Undeniably, the threat is there. Those rocket stocks would have outpaced the ability to destroy them at launch or destroy them on objective. I don't think Rubio was making stuff up the other day when he showed that chart. It makes sense. Look, we know Iran were making rockets fast enough that they got back to where they were before the 12-day war, before this war. So in less than a year, they'd already got back to where they were before the 12-day war. And that is a very fast rocket supply chain. And that's before we even start talking about the drones and the nuclear capability. And we know Iran has the intent. They've demonstrated it time and time again. They also think in generations, because this is an eternal journey, a religious journey until the Mahdi comes back. It's like a Christian waiting for the return of the Messiah or whatever it is. It's coming. We don't know when. We're just going to keep going until it does. Is that mentality? And when you think in those long-term schedules, actually, it doesn't matter if it's today, in 10 years' time, or in 20 years' time. When you fire all those missiles off, you're going to do it at some point. But when is going to be at your discretion. And so, quite understandably, Israel were going to do this without America, even if they were condemned for it, because they just can't allow that loaded gun at their heads, and it's as simple as that.
Yeah, what you said reminded me of the Muslim Brotherhood. They have a 100-year plan. We think in terms of 4-year election cycles. So yeah, they do have a very long view of history. Now, is Israel essentially confronting the same Iranian threat that the rest of the world will eventually have to face? Are the U.S. and Israel the only ones with the guts to go at Iran? Do you think other countries would ever do what they're doing?
I mean, look, it's a different form of threat. For the West, it's subversion, it's assassination, it's those kinds of low-level, not nuisance activities. It's far more than that, but it's not a kind of existential threat in the way that it is for Israel. And I think that's the key difference here, is that they want Israel destroyed. They were building the capability specifically to do that. And they had the intention to do it, and they were just waiting for the opportunity, kind of forced Israel's hand to act. So I don't think any Western country will be in that position. We do certainly see Iranian terror activities, both directly and through their proxies, like Hezbollah. If you look at their drug activities in South America, if you look at their people smuggling, weapon smuggling, drug smuggling in Europe, this is a very distinct security threat that stems from Iran. Unfortunately, the UK is being slow to do this, but that's why we're seeing the prescribed by the EU, by other countries around the world as well. And I think it will be coming for the UK also. But it's because, it's that malign subversive threat rather than that direct existential threat.
Now, I want to get your analysis of the past, 2.5 years from October 7th until now. October 7th, we saw Israel at its lowest point. They were attacked, surprised. All their enemies were at full strength. And fast forward to today, what is your analysis of how Israel was able to bounce back and how resilient they were to where they are, where they are now?
Well, the title of my book coming out later this year is Redemption, Israel's Seven Front War. So I think that gives away how I think it's gone for the last 2.5 years. But, it's an incredible comeback. And it really speaks, I think, to not only military resilience, but also societal resilience. And I guess you don't have any choice but to be resilient when your back's against the wall. There's nowhere else for Jews and Israelis to go other than Israel. So you either stand and fight or you give up and die. And that resilient spirit has really shone through, I think, from the numbers of young men and women who volunteered to go back into uniform, and older men and women as well, actually, of course. It was a whole society effort. But you did have your young men and women fighting in Gaza and Lebanon, incredible special forces missions in Syria, your pilots in the skies over Iran. This is a whole society effort to come back from your country's lowest point since its formation, pretty much. And that really is a testimony to the spirit of the Israeli people, that they've gone from that low point to where they are now with total air superiority and having just killed the Ayatollah. It's a hell of a journey.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I know we've spoken in the past about Gaza. What are your, thoughts about what's going on over there? And has anything changed? What are you hearing about that?
Yeah, look, I think it's America's problem now. I was there in January. I was down at the Civil Military Cooperation Center in Kiryat Gat. But Hamas is entrenched in its half of Gaza. It's not going anywhere. They've used Arrow and Radar to make sure they've got complete control. The Arrow and the deterrence units are the ones that have sort of made sure that Hamas has that iron grip. They've had so much aid go in. Hamas is skimming 30-40% of all of it. That financially, their coffers are now refilled. So that's a stalemate situation. But it's Washington's problem. That's the key point here, is the Israelis are managing the yellow line, and that's about it. That's really all their role is right now. Washington, under the peace deal, decided that it was their problem now. They own it, and they're going to own it until at least the end of Mr. Trump's term, when we might see something else change. But it's going to look like trying to find the security force. We're talking about Indonesians and other countries that are frankly far less effective than the IDF. So it'll be interesting to see how they perform. You've got the local police force now who are not hugely trained. I'm a skeptic, if I'm brutally honest. I don't think Gaza's over yet, but it's over for now. And it's Washington's problem, and Washington's going to have to try and work out what to do with it.
One of the things was that they, I think stage 2 was that Hamas needs to disarm, which also seems like it's an impossibility to do that. So you think we're just stuck at a stalemate?
Look, I don't see a problem with that particularly. Is Israel safe? Yes. There you go. Problem solved. Is it permanently safe? Is Hamas gone forever? No. And that's a longer term problem. But the point is, there's no rush now. That's the really important thing here, is there's no kind of time pressure, there's no financial pressure, there's no political pressure. This can be dealt with slow time. And yeah, it's miserable for the poor Palestinian people who are living in tents and stuff like that. But unfortunately, there's two sides to this, and the other side is Hamas. If you want those people in Palestine, in those tents to go and live in harmony and peace, then, international community, hey, guess what? You have to do something about Hamas. It's not Israel's problem anymore. Like they've done what they had to do. They've won the war they had to win. The international community has spent 2 years hammering Israel over it. Well, cool. Now there's a ceasefire. You've been talking about this for 2 years. We'll get in there and do something. And yeah, Washington will coordinate it, and we'll see how it goes. But like I said, I'm skeptical. I think a lot of Mr. Trump's deals are on a ticking clock that looks exactly like the length of his presidency, and then everything's going to change. And yeah, we just have to wait and see.
You've been to Israel many times. What are your thoughts on just Israel as a country, the society, just as a person? This is not a military question. Just a lot of people in the West don't understand Israel. There's a lot of lies out there, as we spoke about, PR. But what are your personal thoughts about Israeli society and what it's like over there for those who haven't?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a country I'm always sad to leave, and my trips over there, I think I'm on 12 or 13 now. They're always work trips, so I don't get to do as much as I'd like to in terms of just enjoying the country. It's a land of contrasts, really. I think, and that is typified by the difference between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. In Tel Aviv, you've got this incredibly vibrant, very Western city that looks, you squint a bit, and it could be downtown LA in places. It's exactly what you would recognize from a Western city. You drive an hour down the road and you've got the center of civilization. This is where pretty much our entire civilizational history originated in Jerusalem, with that beautiful sandstone. Even the suburbs are made of that brick, and then you go to the old city and it's magical. There's all these contradictions there, and you've got that vibrant, youthful kind of beachfront scene in Tel Aviv with bars, restaurants, and clubs and that sort of stuff. And then you've got the very serious and stately Jerusalem. And then you have the north, which is totally different again. And then you go down to the south, and when you're cutting around the desert in the Negev, it's stunning. So it's a beautiful country, and the people are just so nice. I think that's the key takeaway. So friendly, and there are so many myths that are just stupid, like the apartheid nonsense. Like, I'm a pretty dark-skinned European. I've got a bit of Spanish mixed in there. I am pale-skinned compared to most Israelis, because the European Jews that moved in are absolutely nowhere near the majority. And the majority are from sort of North African and Arabian Peninsula kind of origin. And the idea that this wonderful cultural melting pot that is Tel Aviv is somehow an apartheid country, it's just ludicrous. And look, it's a country that has its flaws, of course it is, but so does every country. You've got hilltop settler youth, and you've got perhaps Ben Gvir and the police force are creating controversies and saying some pretty unpleasant stuff. And, that's just what democracies do, unfortunately. It means that people who say stupid stuff get to have a voice as much as anyone else. I'm from the UK. I'm not going to start criticizing Israel for its flaws, because God knows we have, far more of a share of our own. So it's just a really nice country. I'm very fond of it.
Okay.
Here ends the broadcast on behalf of the Israeli Tourist Board.
Well, Andrew, I want to thank you for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation. I bet our viewers will as well. I want to thank you for saying the truth about Israel. Most people nowadays don't. They say the opposite. I just want to thank you, and I wish you the best. Wish you the best of success. Maybe tell us about your podcast and whatever else you'd like to pop.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, if you want to read my writing on this war and other military topics, I'm on Substack. It's mrandrewfox.substack.com, or you can follow me on X. You'll find me on there. Just search for my name. But I also co-host the Brink podcast with Jake Wallace-Simons, former Jewish Chronicle editor and Daily Telegraph columnist, where we discuss those bigger societal issues that confront us, and we work out how our societies will step back from the brink. So it's called the Brink podcast. And you can find us on Substack or YouTube.
Okay, amazing. All right. Thank you again, and hope to speak to you again soon.
Thanks, Daniel. Take care.
If you have a 401k or an IRA, please listen. Gold is at record highs. What many people don't know is this: you can move part of your retirement money legally and without tax penalties into physical gold you actually own. Alpha Omega Gold helps you do this through a gold IRA. Your gold is real. It is stored safely. It is in your name. Learn more at ao.gold/stand. Alpha Omega Gold is our sponsor, and they proudly stand with Israel.